So I think in a way, having this expansion of digital Bitcoin, central bank digital currencies requires there to be more of what happens on the other side. I think it requires one to be more invested in gold, central banks to be more invested in gold reserve currencies, to have or digital currencies, to have something on the side that's physical as just that hedge. So I look at it not like it's going away because it's a relic, but it's almost like because it's a relic, it has to be there to be the sort of adult in the room if something goes massively wrong.
This is Little by Little with Andy Schectman.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Little by Little. I am so honored to have with me Dr. Nomi Prins. Dr. Prins, thank you so much for joining today. And I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about your background. In doing my research, I was blown away by just how much you've accomplished, starting with a degree in mathematics, a master's degree in statistics, and a PhD in international political economics. And that's just the beginning. Of course, as most people know who've been following you, you are a financial expert, a journalist, spent time on Wall Street. Tell us just a little bit about your background and, from the time in the financial sector to becoming one of the leading voices in this space.
Sure, and thank you. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with you. I'm really happy to be on your show, and I was really looking forward to this conversation for a long time. So I started out my life as a geek, really. I was very much into mathematics. My dad taught me how to program when I was 9. He was a computer engineer for IBM, traveled the world, etc. So I had this installation of looking at data analysis and just really gathering my own insights from both an experiential side, but also from the standpoint of looking at the real numbers. And throughout my career on Wall Street, where I started when I was 19 at Chase, sort of worked my way through a couple of banks that no longer exist, which is Stearns, and where I created an analytics team in London in the 90s. And then ultimately to Lehman Brothers, which didn't also continue to survive. And then at Goldman Sachs, which was my last stop. I was managing director there and on the credit derivatives and analytics side before the scandals of Enron and WorldCom popped up. And I wound up leaving Wall Street really just right after 9/11. I was there actually in the building, 29th floor, corner office of Goldman, when the sort of planes went by. And of course, all of the havoc that created for so many lives in New York, and also a moment to really take stock of my own life. And so I wound up also recognizing that where Wall Street was at that time was in a really dark place. It's no secret that Wall Street likes to make money, profits big, sort of monthly bonuses, quarterly bonuses, annual bonuses, expectations are all part of baked into the cake. But it was a time of a lot of scandal, and it was a time where there was a lot of interaction between Wall Street banks and certain new types of securities and assets that were utilized to really fake the books of a lot of companies, from Enron to WorldCom and many others at the time. And so all of that together caused me to say, you know what, I've got to get out of this. And I wanted to speak about it. At the time, there weren't a lot of people speaking out about what was going on within the industry, from within the industry. There was a lot of sort of looking from the outside, but there wasn't a lot of explanation from the inside. And so I sort of transformed my decade and a half experience internationally in banking to really examine what was going next, the connections to the real economy, the connections to government policies around the world, central bank policies around the world, and continued to grow from starting out as a journalist to becoming an author to being fortunate to be able to speak with groups from individual retail investors to a lot of different sectors throughout the world to governments all around the world about what I really think from my experience, from the history, from the data on all sides of the aisle. So in general, my philosophy is that politics doesn't really matter. In terms of economics, what matters is what's actually going on the ground, how money's flowing, who's making it flow, and what the future of it is throughout the different sectors, including recently, not even recent, actually all the time, but more pronounced now, I focus on real assets, on gold, on silver, on mining assets, on the things that we actually need that require time to produce, to process, to extract, to utilize, to transform as we continue to move about in the world that we share.
That's amazing. Zoltan Pozar calls this environment we are in right now Bretton Woods 3, a system that will be all about commodities and transparency. And certainly I've listened to you speak on many of the conferences that I attend where you are often the keynote speaker, and you do an amazing job at doing just that. And we'll get to some questions on commodities, of course. But I want to focus for a moment, if you would, on President Trump and his threats of imposing 100% tariffs. I think they're more along the lines of sanctions masquerading as tariffs, but imposing these on the BRICS nations. And how might such a move, in your mind, impact the ongoing shift away from the U.S. dollar dominance?
That's such an excellent question. I think that's one that we're gonna see unfold over, obviously, the administration. The way I look at it, first of all, with respect to the tariff part, President Trump, in his first term, increased tariffs on our allies as well as on our competitors, from China and so forth. And the Biden administration actually continued them. We just didn't really talk about it that much. I mean, actually, one of the first pieces that I wrote on Prinsights, the first piece, in fact, was about the comparison of the expanded tariffs under the Biden administration that had been initiated by the Trump administration. Now we're in sort of cycle 3 of that. Where we will get some form of tariffs from the Trump administration. The question is, what will they look like? And then to the second part of your question, how will they speed the impetus of other nations to trade away from the U.S. dollar in order to protect their own economies and national interests? I don't think there's any way possible to have a 100% tariff on all BRICS nations or on all nations that don't trade exclusively in the dollar, because that's absolutely impossible to track. Even right now, there's a lot of product that we get, for example, from China that doesn't come from China. It goes through Malaysia to us and so forth. I mean, there's all sorts of supply chain links that are really impossible to tariff along the way. And if that were to ever occur, it would really be a dramatic pinch to our own economy, as well as to the economies of all the countries that we deal with, and therefore to our own economy. Will there be a rise in some tariffs, and to what extent there will be? You talked about raising tariffs on Canada, on Mexico, our nearest allies with whom we do a significant amount of trade. And in terms of the BRICS nations increasing tariffs on China, it's not quite clear what's going to happen with Brazil. Of course, Brazil is a country with a tremendous amount of natural resources, and increasingly, I think, will be prominent in the world for processing and for technology manufacturing, because it just has really cheap energy and it's just well positioned geographically. And I think that the Trump administration is going to have to do some thinking about those supply chains. And if we really do put those sorts of tariffs on, they're not just threats, the ones that actually come into play, how much money that brings into revenues for the United States and how much it costs the United States. In terms of revenues, tariffs so far, even with those 2 administration increases, only account for about 2% of the money that comes into the Treasury, of the money that we use to operate the U.S. budget. It's a very small amount. So, I mean, even if you increased everything by 100% and there was no change in trade flows at all, and everyone just sort of coughed it up at the bottom level, you're still only talking at the most 4% of revenues coming from tariffs, which is an impossibility anyway. But I mean, that would be the most you could get to. So I don't think any of that's going to happen. I think we're going to see some. I think more than that, we're going to see more anxiety and uncertainty and tariff wars that are going to produce an inflationary outcome for the products in which they're involved. Whether or not that's a one-to-one to the tariffs that are imposed, or it's simply a magnification of the expectations of what those tariffs could do. But oftentimes, and we've seen this in the last 2 administrations, when tariffs increase, the highest bump that happens in prices is really around the initial period, because it takes the anxiety of the costs, it takes the expectation of the cost, and it takes all the middle companies to increase their prices at that time in order to circumvent potential future cost. So a lot of what we'll feel and experience will be in the beginning of these policies, whatever they happen to be. And other countries don't want to deal with that. Other countries want to continue to diversify away from the dollar. We've seen a lot of that happen in terms of financial systems, trade agreements, dualities in currencies, swap lines between, for example, Russia and the People's Bank of China, the Russia Central Bank, and more of that's going to continue to increase as the mechanisms for diversifying away from the dollar.
It sounds to me, sometimes maybe the carrot is better than the stick, and I think it's questionable whether or not these policies really are going to end up being beneficial. But certainly, as someone of the art of the deal, President Trump, the master of the deal, I suppose, he lifts the bar high and then works back from there. But I guess we'll see. Follow-up question on the BRICS. They've been very vocal about their efforts to reduce their reliance on the dollar, as we just talked about. And they've even hinted about the possibility of backing a new settlement currency, not a reserve currency for now, but a settlement currency. And speaking of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil and the head of the BRICS New Development Bank, came out recently and said that in principle, they've agreed to a new settlement currency called the unit, which is 40% gold backed. And in your view, with this in mind, how legitimate are the BRICS ambitions, and what an impact do you think that these types of initiatives could ultimately have on the global financial system moving ahead?
Well, first of all, these are things that take a very long time, many years, to come to any sort of fruition. There are movements along the way that are slow and sort of are transitioning, I think, right now. In terms of whether it's the units backed by gold or whether it's a collection of central bank digital currencies that can operate on a global payment system and settlement system, which are being developed. China has one that's being prototyped. Brazil has one that's being prototyped. There's a lot of conversations around the sort of edges of the last G20. I was in Rio last month. There's a lot of conversations around the edges about a payment system, a settlement system that can really compete or be a major alternative to the SWIFT system, which is more U.S. and Eurocentric. So it's good that you mentioned that, because a lot of people, I think, don't realize that if you don't have the payment system and the settlement system, you can't really transform a currency. It's not the reserve currency composition that changes at central banks. It's all these little pieces along the way. And those are being worked on. And what Rousseff did is, actually, she came into her position at the New Development Bank on the wake of other people who had been in that position, the Brazil seat. Now, and she's the president, but all of the BRICS countries, the first five, have sort of executive positions as part of the New Development Bank, and then one is the head, which she is right now. So they all have a sort of communication going about this in their different ways. And I think that gold, one of the reasons that the idea is for gold to come back into being some sort of a balance to what will probably be a digital currency of some sort, and as a central bank collection, or the use of multiple central bank digital currencies within one payment system when it comes to fruition, is having a component of gold there would require any central bank using the system potentially to have a reserve of gold that it can use to back the system or to back their currency component in the system. And that brings back a sort of quasi gold standard. I would think initially for being able to use the system, to be participants, you have to have, perhaps a certain percentage of gold in your reserves. And for example, if we look at China, right now it has about 5% of its reserves in gold, which is low compared to Russia, which has sort of double digits of percentage. Poland has actually a high percentage of gold. But they're a long way to go in terms of where they could decrease the reserves that they have still in treasuries in the US dollar versus buying gold. But since 2018, since these tariffs kind of started initiating under the last Trump administration, they have dropped the amount of reserves that they have had from $1.3 trillion worth of US dollars of treasury bonds to about $750 billion. So almost in half. And at the same time, they've increased their gold amount, not by the same magnitude. They've diversified in other ways as well, but they've increased their gold amount to 5% from less than 2% of their reserves. And that's just movement. That's a pattern that's going to continue. And so then if you connect as those central banks, BRICS or BRICS Plus, or their allies, their trading partners, into this system, and all of them have to have a certain percentage of gold as a ticket to entry, which is what she's basically saying. And it is a way to diversify from any paper asset, certainly the dollar. Then you can see them buying more gold and being a component that way. So there's a lot of steps along the way. The primary step is to actually get the technology of a system working that enables quick payments and quick settlements and secure messaging and crypto protection and all of the things that are the nitty gritty of a massive global payment system as we evolve into that.
Yeah, you can see the central banks buying an awful lot of gold, especially the BRICS nations buying an awful lot of gold, and that would fit like a hand in glove with what you're saying. Let's shift gears just a little bit, Nomi, and want to talk about something I saw you put out about a year ago that made an indelible imprint on the way that I look at things and some of the things that I see coming. And in particular, it was a digital ID and a digital currency you spoke a lot about in this. I don't even know what we would call it, a documentary or an expose or whatever it was fantastic. And I want to touch on a couple of points that you made in there, and I want to get your opinion. But to lay the groundwork, President Trump has released a series of strong statements recently supporting the need for a digital ID in the name of election integrity. And we find out that the United Kingdom is right now in the process of rolling out their digital IDs, once again, to prove their status. And so in this documentary that you spoke of, you talk about the Digital ID 2020, and it's a digital initiative, if you will, that aims to integrate passports, driver's license, credit cards, transit passes, and health records into a single system. And I kept noticing a thread in what you were talking about, a common thread, and it was Bill Gates and it was Microsoft. We'll talk about that in a moment, but this digital ID is not backed by just a bunch of nobodies. It's some massive partnerships, both public and private, and those would be Microsoft, Accenture, Gavi, which is the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, and the Rockefeller Foundation. So even under President Trump, do you believe that there is a coordinated global agenda driving the push for a digital identification system?
I do. And a lot of these initiatives, they're years in the making, and they don't stop because of even a president who is as, I'd say, good at pushing his agenda forward, whether by executive order or deal making or whatever it might be, as Trump has been. And I'm sure will prove to be. And so I think that you can't just, even with that, stop this initiative to effectively gather global data. Now, like with the digital payment system we were just talking about, gathering global data in one place is a massive undertaking. And so the way to break that down is to consolidate data across, say, multinational companies that operate in sort of a global space, not everywhere in the world, but in a global manner, with governments who have an incentive and in often cases a policy to actually have what they consider to be national security driven data integrity. And the best place to think of that is just in terms of whether anybody has flown recently through certain airports, just the general changing of things from showing your passport and having physical interaction with an agent and so forth, to just literally looking at a machine that takes your photo very quickly and sort of pushes you through in and out of countries. It doesn't just push you through, it has all of your information. And right now that information might be limited to more obvious identification about us, our birth date, our location, our citizenship, name, etc. But once you have the technology, and it's generally either blockchain or Ethereum based, depending on what is contractual or data linked together, following you around, or following one around, or following itself around, or following data, all of that becomes easier to sort of culminate into a larger digital ID. And from the standpoint of other policies that Trump and other administrations have, and people across the aisles of different countries, certainly the United States, are very focused on national security. It's the one thing that is used as a reason to do so many things in the United States, whether that is to aggregate data, whether that is to have an international or national ID, whether that is to just look at how bank accounts operate and sort of protect us from money laundering and fraud, but at the same time see the tracking of how our payments and where they're going and where they're coming from and so forth, just in general. All of that is connected to a national security broad banner. And hence it tends to be supported by, as I said, all members of Congress, and it tends to have a life longer than any presidential administration.
You do this long enough and you realize, Nomi, that there's a fine line between conspiracy and reality. And maybe I become cynical, but, as much as I want to believe it's about national security, and to a degree I do, you also have to wonder, is it spooky? Is it entering that dystopian Black Mirror, no privacy, everything you do is tracked, everywhere you go is tracked? It's kind of spooky when you think about it. On one hand, it's comforting knowing that, maybe our safety will be increased. On the other hand, it gets a little spooky. Along similar lines, you've also, in this documentary, you spoke about the drive towards a cashless society. And you opened my eyes to United Nations-based Better Than Cash Alliance. Again, Bill Gates involved in this. A partnership of governments, companies, and international organizations working to accelerate the transition from cash to digital payments. That's right off their website.
Right.
This alliance includes major players like Citibank, Ford, Coca-Cola, MasterCard, Visa, and 80 world governments. You mentioned in this video that Visa filed for a patent, the U.S. patent for a digital fiat currency, which, according to their website, would generate digital versions of fiat currency linked to their physical counterparts using the serial numbers of the bills. In fact, reported on a blockchain for traceability, and then removing the physical currency from circulation. And the example you gave was the Super Bowl in Tampa Bay. In fact, they did it again last year in Las Vegas, sponsored by Visa, utilizing what's called reverse ATMs, where you come in there, you put your money in, and out comes a card. Do you think we're inevitably heading towards a cashless future? And what are the broader implications of this shift in your mind?
Yeah, so I mean, everything that you're mentioning, it's interesting because all of this is in broad daylight, right? I mean, if you go in there's those reverse ATMs. I've seen them at baseball stadiums as well, and I think St. Louis, but I'm not entirely sure, but like in the middle of the country, just throughout everywhere, right? And the idea of that is to facilitate that transfer. It would be very scary if a government or a central bank or any bank would say, hey, give us all your paper money that you have, or worse, we're just going to discount it completely unless you convert over to whatever our version of a digital currency is. And so it's done in all these stages. The United States actually is sort of behind in some of the digitization of currency, or going cashless relative to other countries. I'd spent time a summer ago in Scandinavia, going through Norway, Sweden, Finland. These countries have literally no cash anywhere. And unless you have an app, and Sweden's one example, an app that is basically owned by the 5 largest banks in Sweden, unless you have that app, you basically can't buy anything. And even homeless people that have phones, as I had seen they do, have to have this app in order to facilitate getting money, and then they can go into a local store and they can get food. It's off of the phone. So it's happening more so in countries where the banks have been more actively involved with the central bank in terms of removing cash from society. There are a lot of signs saying that you can't use cash. I was just in Brazil, as I mentioned, for the G20, and there was a number of places I went into, just local small businesses. There was one place that was a lovely, farm to table organic coffee, little tiny hole in the wall, and they're like, no cash, you have to use Pix. And Pix is it's the central bank owned digital payment system in Brazil. It is used right now by 100 million people and growing, and it's small, but they're making deals now with countries around the world. It's only been around since COVID. So, a lot of movements are happening. And the downside is that to the extent that they are using blockchain technology, which a lot of them are not yet. So there's this other integration that's happening on the other side of this. There's a payment system, there's a usage of digital and cashless, and then there's the blockchain component. And if and when that connects, then any of your data is really connected in one place. It does follow you around, and it's connected digitally. And unless you opt out, unless you have, and this is where gold comes in, unless you have gold or silver, something that can use as like an exchange value on the side, you're really not just not just attached to a cashless environment. But if anything goes down, if a satellite goes down, if your internet goes down, if your phone has no battery, if whatever, you don't have a means by which to buy things, and that's very scary. And I'm not saying people are going to go around to gas stations with gold coins, but in the limit, if we don't have cash, there has to be something else that isn't technological as a backup.
Yeah, and I don't have this note. I have just one more question for you before, but I don't have this note. But I remember in the documentary, you talk about a Freedom of Information Act memorandum that you got from the IRS that basically said, well, we're not planning on doing this, but it actually would, if we wanted to, you could actually freeze people's accounts. You could limit their ability. I mean, it's very frightening when you think about the possible ramifications. It starts out with the camel's nose under the tent, and where does it go from there? It's concerning.
And also, and on that, but just sorry to cut you off.
Please, no, please do. Thank you.
It's absolutely concerning, and also, right now, the IRS, the Treasury Department, has the ability to go into our bank accounts and take money out to pay for, outstanding taxes, to garnish wages at source, to anything they can sort of connect into. But it's really the bigger banks that are willing and even potentially necessary partners in this system. But if you have a more digital system, then a lot of that can just happen at source. And what that takes out is the ability of people to manage how and when they pay taxes as well.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of possibilities wrapped up in this that we're just beginning to understand, but very fascinating. And I appreciate your candor very much. A last question, kind of an easy one, at least from a standpoint of everything we've just talked about, and kind of answered it, but I'd like to put a bow on it and say, how do you see gold competing or coexisting not only with cryptocurrencies nowadays, but also with central bank digital currencies, as it appears we're heading that way, as a key player still in the financial system? As some people say, it's an archaic relic of the past and it's going by the wayside of the dodo bird. What's your opinion?
It is certainly a relic of the past, but also it's a need in the future, because to simply rely on a digital or central bank digital currency or digital payment systems across, from individuals up through central banks and governments, means that you have no ability to diversify in case of any emergency, in case of any systems outage, in case of any major frauds or whatever might happen. It's not really safe. I actually think the advent of more digital currency progress, which will continue, and at the central bank level, makes it more necessary to have that hedge and to have that gold in reserve. Something like China, the People's Bank of China, has done a lot of advancement in terms of their digital currency system, prototyping it, allowing other companies outside of China to sort of tap into it for settlements, tests, and that sort of thing. And yet they're still buying gold. So I think in a way, having this expansion of digital Bitcoin, a central bank digital currencies, requires there to be more of what happens on the other side. I think it requires one to be more invested in gold, central banks to be more invested in gold reserve currencies, to have or digital currencies, to have something on the side that's physical as just that hedge. So I look at it not like it's going away because it's a relic, but it's almost like because it's a relic, it has to be there to be the sort of adult in the room if something goes massively wrong. And silver's the other extent of that, right? Because central banks many can also buy silver and keep it in their reserves. I mean, just recently, the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, the central banks enable gold to be considered, high quality reserve asset. This is old but yet new in terms of central banks being able to have that, because they recognize the safety component of it. At the same time, the BIS is deeply involved in creating digital systems and in supporting the evolving of central bank digital currencies and systems. So I think everywhere we look, except possibly the United States Federal Reserve, we are seeing an active set of proponents for utilizing gold in more ways than we had beforehand. And as a result, it's one of the reasons we see such high prices in gold, even with Bitcoin going crazy this year. We've certainly seen gold hold in there. And if it were becoming a relic, I think you would see quite the opposite.
Right. I don't think the BIS would have reclassified gold a tier 1 asset if it were a relic. And you can read between the lines with Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF's comment that a CBDC not pegged to something is fiat. Dr. Prins, I think you missed your calling. I think you should be in politics. I think you should be working for the Treasury. Someone with as sharp of a mind and as open of a mind as you have would be a delight to have on our behalf in government. And I say that sincerely, but tongue-in-cheek. In any case, Nomi, how can people find you? I know this is your Prinsights Substack, but what's the best way for people to follow your work? And I thank you so much for coming on today. It was absolutely fantastic.
Again, I appreciate so much having this conversation and all of the analysis you've done of very important topics that I've been involved with over time. Prinsights is the best place right now, Substack, in terms of the regularity of my work. That's where I'm doing more writing and speaking with folks and focusing predominantly on all the issues we just talked about, on de-dollarization, on real assets, on mining, on Federal Reserve policy, on central banks, on how government policy and tariffs impact our economic lives and so forth. It's all going to be on that. Of course, my books, which are on Amazon. You can find, I have a website as well, nomiprins.com. But in terms of the dynamic writing, this is where I'm doing a lot of that right now.
Yeah, and that first interview there with my mentor and friend Rick Rule, who's meant so much to me over my career. That's usually where I see you as a keynote speaker, and I look forward to seeing you in 6 months in my backyard here in Boca. Dr. Prins, you were fantastic. One of my favorite interviews I've ever done. Thank you so much for coming on. I look forward to catching up with you in person and having you back on the show somewhere down the road to reflect on what's happening and look back at what we've talked about here and see how much of it actually comes true. But I wish you and your family happy holidays and a very happy and healthy new year, and all the best to you.
Thank you, and likewise.
Thank you.
Little by Little with Andy Schectman.